Hello, Void and all who inhabit it. It's me, and I now have the long term goal to write a review so scathing it inspires the creation of an unseen, unnamed secondary antagonist of an entire 1 hour and 45-minute long film. Full disclosure, because this may determine if you would like to continue on, I don't think Sam Livingston is a good writer. I don't. I think he is good at setting up actors to thrive in certain scenes, but in terms of writing a strong, cohesive story or good characters, no. And him being good girlfriends with a well loved actress who does do very well in the spaces that he leaves in his narratives for actors to improvise does not negate that. I was going to jokingly start this off by referring to Livingston as the white man's Tyler Perry, but Malcolm and Marie was written in 6 days and Livingston only directs things that he writes, so maybe that's actually not that far off. There's an interview in Esquire that got a bit of attention around the time of Malcolm and Marie's release because Livingston is quoted in it as saying, "White establishment critics tend to categorize things and talk about them in a way that can sometimes speak to their own importance." To which people were like, pot, meet kettle. But right after that quote, the interviewer asked Livingston if he felt anxious about portraying that as a white filmmaker, which was kind of a soft question to me. I felt like the film was very clear on how Livingston felt about the ability to portray an experience that isn't the same as your own. But, the speaker and the artist aren't always the same, so it helps to clarify and ask. Livingston's answer was no, because I have faith in the collaborative process and in my partners that if I write something that doesn't feel true, that John David or Zendaya don't respond to or feel to be honest, that they're going to say something and we'll work it out. I don't have anxiety in that sense because I have too much respect for the collaborative nature of filmmaking. Maybe to Livingston, the range of collaboration is just conversations with the actors that he can then embed into the script. Maybe it's the tweaks to lines and the flow of certain dialogue in the midst of filming. And that's not to discredit the influence that John David and Zendaya had, but rather to point out that the structure of the narrative, the motivation, and the backstories of the characters were all on one person's plate first, were filtered through this one person's perspective initially. But the other thing that really stuck out about this answer and about the idea of a collaborative creative process in general was the phrasing of finding what feels to be honest, honoring what feels to be true. I found this particularly interesting because of the theme of authenticity that pops up in the film. Malcolm believes that authenticity is nothing more than an overused buzzword, while Marie argues that having genuine experience in the story that you are creating can help make a stronger story. Regardless of who you agree with, the film continues to bring us back to this question of authenticity. What is it worth? Who decides what is or isn't authentic? What good is it to the filmmaker, to the actress, to the critic? Considering both the repeating theme in Malcolm and Marie and Livingston's answer in this interview pushed me to think a little bit deeper about what Livingston shows us about authenticity, about genuine, honest depictions of experiences and characters, both in this film and in other bits of his work. I think overall, Livingston depends on an ability to fall back on honesty to support his poorly written stories and weakly created characters. To start with Malcolm and Marie, let's just get this kidney stone of a story out of the way. The relationship can be summarized in 3 key sequences. The first starts with, "You are the neediest man I have ever dated," and ends with, "I wish I didn't share so much with you." The second is Malcolm's bathroom monologue, and the third is Marie's last monologue. In those 3 sequences, you have very easily built up the imbalance in their relationship. You have seen Malcolm's need to escalate arguments to the point of submission in order to win, and you get to witness Marie's final understanding of what is at the root of the toxicity in their entire relationship. Notably, throughout this whole film, the moments when Malcolm and Marie are most at peace, are most enjoying each other and laughing and joking, are the parts when they are roasting the film industry and critics specifically. Collaborating with the actors may have helped Livingston's 45-word-long sentences flow better, but the potential to do something more with the dialogue is lost because as a writer, he's unable to do anything more than return to the same points again and again. At the core of Malcolm's whole rant about critics is the irritation that his work isn't being critiqued on its merit, but based off of his identity and how it impacts the way the story is told. The film starts with Malcolm describing how his work has been compared to Spike Lee and John Singleton and Barry Jenkins, to which he replies, "What about William Wyler?" which is a way to force a comparison between his work and the work of a director who isn't Black. But this line of irritation quickly gives way to long, breathless rambling about the harm he wants to do to one critic specifically. And in that, I understand why people are reading Malcolm as Livingston's mouthpiece. It feels like such a white person complaint to have to actually consider how your identity impacts your worldview. The part where Malcolm gets irritated at the critic for seeing his film as making a statement about race in the healthcare industry was frustrating initially to me. It felt like he was being willfully obtuse about the societal influences that would impact, if not his telling of that story, the way somebody else would interpret it, which going further felt like something a privileged writer would have put in this film. But beyond the general distaste for critics, Malcolm focuses most of his ire on the one white lady at the LA Times, which a lot of people perceived as being a dig at a real-life white lady at the LA Times that wrote a scathing review of Livingston's second film. The bulk of Malcolm's irritation, the trigger for Marie's final understanding, are both connected to one kind of critic who utilizes one lens of critique: the consideration of the impact of the identity of the storyteller on the way the story is being told. If your identity-centered worldview is inseparable from your work, which in Livingston's case pops up as the palpable chokehold of the male gaze, that someone can create an entire review just unpacking that, maybe there's a reason for that. And maybe the reason isn't just that the critic is a self-centered, pedantic asshole who's only interested in writing masturbatory reviews. It is important to note that the critic in the film sees the influence of Malcolm's identity-based worldview, at least in terms of his race, positively. But whether you see Malcolm's rants as coming from Livingston or not, as a reflection of Livingston's lived experience or not, the parts of the film that talk about critics are telling us that the film industry cares more about who is speaking than what they are saying. Because Malcolm is Black, a trope that he actually leaned into must have been subverted, while because he is a man, he must be exploiting his female main character when he has her topless in a scene. The genuine message of the film is lost because the critic is so focused on the filmmaker, which, funnily enough, also happened with this film. Case in point. Having a critic be more focused on you than your art is a genuine concern that's used to prop up Malcolm as a piece of trash human worth listening to. He's a broken clock, but it's 2:57, so on this, he's accurate. On top of all of this, the major downside to viewing Malcolm's frustration as Livingston speaking through the character, the gotcha, is that this viewpoint ignores the real irritation behind typecasting. Irritation that Livingston seemingly pulled from conversations with Zendaya. Black actors, writers, directors, people in the entertainment industry in general feel the tension of an inability to have a more dynamic career because of a belief that your identity should limit you to certain stories. It reminds me of the article that came out after Queen and Slim was released, in which Daniel Kaluuya was quoted as saying he was tired of being asked about race, which then led to a lot of people asking, okay, so then why did you just do Queen and Slim? Why did you just sign on to the Fred Hampton biopic? And those are good questions. There is a part of this conversation about people who are willfully ignorant or dismissive of the impact that race or other identity markers do have on certain stories. But both the Guardian article and the knee-jerk reactions to it missed out on the chance to have a more expansive, nuanced conversation about typecasting. Malcolm and Marie seems like it's going to add more to this, but then it doesn't. Or even if the film didn't want to make a statement about typecasting, other than the fact that it's annoying and frustrating, it could have been really interesting to have that conversation run parallel to Malcolm and Marie's relationship with regards to being reduced to a set of traits that are so wide sweeping it makes you interchangeable. The whole scene by the bathtub, Malcolm is listing off behaviors and traits that Marie thinks are special to her, but which he is taking the time to list all the other people he actually took them from. Being given the message that you are so replaceable, so disposable, that I just need to find another person who is X to fill the spot that you hold, and trying to push against that in a way that also pushes the other person to see how limited their view is, that would have been fascinating to see that occurring in their relationship and mirrored in this conversation about typecasting. But instead, I felt like I was watching Bad Hair again. The film is reminding me of the limits placed to Black people in different professional arenas because of embedded systemic issues. Okay, what else are you trying to say? Who are you speaking to? Are you just an outsider who is expanding and building upon insider information that you've gained access to? Is this just a regurgitated venting session filtered through Black characters but meant to connect to any creative who fears and hates the idea of being pigeonholed? I think conversations around typecasting, the way it stunts people's careers, and what can be done to proactively work away from it are needed. I don't think the way to do so, however, is through a self-aggrandizing character who, for valid reasons, so painfully reads as a self-insert of the privileged director. It's made worse by the way the couple's comments about the film industry mostly provide moments for Malcolm to wax poetic about his greatness or whine ad nauseum. And Marie, while she laughs at Malcolm's explosion, she has that whole anti-SJWS speech about actors and directors all just being hoes, being fraudulent vessels for capitalism, so stop bitching and keep slinging, way before she agrees with the critic. The characters themselves don't seem to care deeply about the more recognizable frustration, the irritation behind being typecast or limited, which in turn just feels like a talking point instead of a bit of dialogue that could have had purpose. Now, I do want to be clear here that this doesn't mean that Marie or Malcolm needed to come out and say, and that's why systemic racism is bad. But why the fuck are these characters burning rubber on the same topic repeatedly, if not to say something about it, if not to reach some further point, if not to at least have this conversation be mirrored by something else in the film? Malcolm's goal seemingly is to prove critics wrong by listing better directors with stronger work, pointing to excellence as proof that you can write a story about an experience that is so foreign to your own. But do we need a 2-hour-long screaming listicle to do that? Maybe the comments about critics are just a roast for roast's sake. Maybe it's just a means of browbeating the audience with Malcolm's obnoxiousness. But there's one other factor at play that makes me a little more hesitant to give Levinson the benefit of the doubt. I read the Assassination Nation review that a lot of people think the in-film review is based off of. In it, Katie Walsh, the white lady at the LA Times in question, describes a scene near the end of Assassination Nation as a boneheaded lecture about feminism, which, other than making me think of Pinhead Larry, had me consider how often Levinson relies on a moment in the story to explain his way out of the terrible decisions that were made beforehand. It's very much, I can't be the thing because I know the words. In the same Esquire article I mentioned earlier, Levinson says, "I don't know why the film would be hard to critique. Marie agrees with the critic," suggesting that Levinson values the words of critics, that they can be useful because, look, my main character agreed with one. Going further, in an interview of Levinson by Zendaya, she brought up the common interpretation that the critic in the film is an interpretation of Walsh in her Assassination Nation review. At the end of his response to that point, Levinson says, "Marie agreeing with the critic gets at the larger theme of what the film is about, which is learning to listen to critique and grow from it, not just as an artist, but more importantly as a human being. But it is fascinating that certain people's interpretation of the film completely negates Marie's counterpoint, which I would argue is the emotional core of the film. And I think in some ways they're essentially mirroring Malcolm's dismissal and refusal to listen to Marie and acknowledge her validity." So, interpreting Malcolm as Levinson and the film as a ranting outlet is dismissing Marie's final understanding. If you view the film as a manifestation of Levinson's inability to grow, you are ignoring the character who points out the importance of learning to change. You can know what to do and still not do it. Levinson can, through Marie, point out the need to accept constructive criticism while still being unable to do so himself. If anything, I think he should be worried about people interpreting the film as him learning the words to avoid being called the thing without actually doing any of the work. I will say Marie's monologue at the end of the film is one of the best of the very few good scenes in the entire movie. But after watching Malcolm berate her for an hour and 35 minutes, Marie's 10-minute breakdown of his bullshit wasn't as satisfying because I was exhausted. If Malcolm is to be seen as the director's mouthpiece or just directors, creatives, people unable to change in general, and Marie is to be seen as the critic or at least the opposition to the unyielding individual, I think it makes sense to question how to interpret a film that spends the majority of its runtime beating down the critic, even if she's right in the end. Within the film, we also see some of the pre-made defense made with a few buzz phrases Marie says, mostly at the beginning of the movie. For me, at least, these functioned as a defense for the inclusion of shitty behavior through acknowledgement without doing any of the work to unravel that behavior. One scene at the end where Marie again reads Malcolm for filth is not working to unravel the emotional journey that is this film. Malcolm and Marie has been compared to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf quite a bit, but one of the many differences between the two films is that Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf takes the time to build onto George and Martha's argument and the complexity of their relationship throughout the duration of the film. Malcolm and Marie just keep circling around the major wound in their relationship. So yes, we get this scene at the end where Marie finally tells Malcolm off, but we spend so much time twisting around the drain that her monologue at the end feels tacked on instead of a natural progression of where this argument was headed to. An egregious example of tacking on an explanation, as seen in another body of Livingston's work, occurs in Euphoria with Maddie's background scene. Rue, who is narrating the sequence, lets us know that Maddie's first time having sex was at 14 with a 30-year-old man, but she was totally in control, so it's not weird. Even though the narrative and the structure of the show, at least in the first season, isn't going to do shit to address the hypersexualization of its teen girl characters, we have this one line about agency, so it can't really be that bad. We're being edgy, we're pushing the envelope, we're testing boundaries. You can't say that this is toxic, empty-headed bullshit because look, the subject is aware of the toxicity inherent in the story. I am aware of the toxicity because I'm pointing it out. I think this is also why it feels like Levinson is inserting himself through the dialogue. Malcolm's lines are so heavy-handed, so exhausting, that what is supposed to be a dramatic art house monologue feels like a lecture. With Marie, it's a bit better with her things being sprinkled throughout in the aforementioned buzzwords, but both characters have moments where their dialogue feels like it is for the audience's benefit, not for the stories. How authentic is a statement that feels shoehorned in for the filmmaker's future defense? How organic is the progression of this argument when the bulk of it just feels like who can say the biggest words without taking a breath in between? Given that the relationship, that the argument is the only thing this movie is about, it is impossible to ignore the clunkiness and the way that authentic topics are just thrown in at moments without a consistent consideration of what that means for the story or the characters. I think Levinson writes stories that are more like a collection of scenes and characters who have big dramatic moments, but neither the people nor the narrative progress in a way that feels natural. The authenticity that does or doesn't exist in his writing, depending on which of his interviews you are reading, is established and clarified by outright telling the audience how to interpret a scene or a story or an entire film. As a result, he relies on heavy-handed, nearly or completely breaking the fourth wall type of dialogue to justify his decisions when the writing should be strong enough to do that on its own. While this is apparent in much of Livingston's writing, in Malcolm and Marie, there is unfortunately little to distract us. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. I hope you are staying warm. I know that Texas is down bad, girl. And I'm going to link some resources, both if you are living in Texas or if you want to help people living in Texas, down below. I'm also going to link Kim from For Harriet's review, because she did a good job of looking a bit more at the responses to the film and the way that people felt about the way critics were talked about in the film, that I think is really interesting. This movie depleted my life force. It was emotional abuse, the feature film. Regardless of anything else, the nastiness of the relationship was a lot, mama. It was a lot. If you're gonna watch this movie, good luck, girl. I wish you all the best. Anyway, my next video is going to take a while, so I need to go work on that. Until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.